This week's blog post is the second part of a walking tour of sculptures in Manhattan's financial district. In this segment, we talk about a controversial sculpture that used to be in this neighborhood. It's a good illustration of the importance of a sculpture's setting and the limits of what such a setting can do. The sculpture was designed to stand in the big open space just south of the main entrance to City Hall, a block down the street from Surratt's Court, which we looked at last week. For Martini's sculptures in front of Surratt's Court, we were able to figure out the subject based on the details and the location. What can we learn from looking at this figure? The main figure is 15 feet tall, so he's almost 3 times my height. He seems young, strong, and confident. His face is serious or expressionless, and he holds a sword over his shoulder. Behind his back, he's holding something, but even in person, it's not clear if it's a rope, a plant, or something else. Let's look at what's at his feet. There are 2 female torsos, but instead of legs, they have scaly tails that twine around the man's feet, although they don't touch him. So we'll call them mermaids. One of these mermaids has an octopus for hair, over here, and the other is holding a skull with her finger poked through the eye socket. Near them at the man's feet is a shipwreck. So these 2 mermaids clearly represent something evil, but it's not obvious what. So far the message seems to be, good guy has triumphed over evil, but we can't get any further than that from the sculpture itself. According to the sculptor, Frederick MacMonnies, this work represents the triumph of civic virtue. It was intended to show good politics triumphing over vice and corruption, with the main figure holding behind his back the net that the evil mermaids had tried to use to ensnare him. Quoting MacMonnies, "The man tries with single-minded energy to stand upright and hold up the sword of law while freeing himself almost unconsciously from the snares thrown about him. He looks out into the distance, so concentrated on his great ideal that he does not even see the temptation, but steps out triumphantly and places his foot on a firm rock." That's the end of the MacMonnies quote. New York politics in the late 19th century was notoriously corrupt. It was the era of Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. My post on the Mitchell Memorial near the reservoir has more on that. The triumph of civic virtue refers to the fact that the influence of New York City's political machines and political bosses had been much reduced by the early 20th century. The sculpture was created specifically for the open plaza in front of City Hall. Its creation was delayed, in fact, while 2 huge old government buildings were torn down to create the open plaza. But the sculpture doesn't convey that this is the triumph of civic virtue very clearly. Even in its original setting, the meaning was unclear. MacMonnies was capable of excellent work. We'll see his hail in a week or 2 on this walking tour. Civic Virtue, however, is not one of his best works. But it did become his most controversial, which is why it's no longer in front of City Hall. MacMonnies began sculpting Civic Virtue in 1909, before the First World War broke out. Due to the demolition of buildings and subway construction near City Hall, it wasn't installed until 1922. What had happened meanwhile, aside from a major war? In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote. With an eye on all those shiny new voters, New York City Mayor John Hyland showed a photo of Civic Virtue to a women's group before it was set in place. The women were outraged. They decried the sculpture as sexist, a man trampling women. The creatures at the man's feet aren't human women, although they're female, and he's not touching them. But why would we quibble about details on an emotional political issue? Despite the objections of the women's group, the sculpture was erected in front of City Hall in 1922 in a huge fountain basin. And now we'll look at what happened to Civic Virtue. In A Flight with Fame, the first full-length biography of MacMonnies, Mary Smart describes the final months of MacMonnies' life. Quote, "In an obsessive effort to find out what had gone wrong with his civic virtue and possibly correct it, MacMonnies wrapped himself in sweaters and scarves and worked in his cold studio during the opening months of 1937. He built A large group depicting the female as a symbol rising above the ignorance and brute strength of man. He never finished the sculpture. He contracted pneumonia and died on the night of March 22nd, 1937. That's the end of the quote from Smart. So clearly the reaction to Civic Virtue really disturbed MacMonnies. In 1941, under Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and Parks Commissioner Robert Moses, Civic Virtue was banished to Queens. There it stood in a smaller fountain basin on the grounds of the Queens County Courthouse, although it was too far away for the government connection to be obvious. In Queens, Civic Virtue was still often condemned as sexist. The borough's politicians allocated no money for maintenance. By the early 21st century, it had been vandalized, it was disintegrating, and it was covered in pigeons and pigeon droppings. One Queens politician suggested that it be sold off on Craigslist. In late 2012, the sculpture was quietly hauled out of Queens. In 2013, without fanfare, Civic Virtue was installed in the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. It had been cleaned and repaired. It will never be a lovely sculpture, but it does look better than it has for decades. Unfortunately, the fountain basin on which it used to sit has been left in Queens, so the mermaids and the shipwreck are bereft of their ocean. In my opinion, it is not the proper business of government to commission or to own sculptures. But if it owns sculptures and isn't willing to maintain them, it should sell them off rather than simply letting them crumble to dust. I'm glad that Civic Virtue ended up in the Greenwood rather than slowly eroding in Queens. For more on this, see my essay, Politics in Portrait Sculptures. Next week, in part 3 of the walking tour, we will see the first of 2 media moguls. DianeDuranteWriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, Central Park, and my many other obsessions. To join the free Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDuranteWriter.com. Thank you as always for listening.